Welcome to remote learning. So what we're going to do in this video is I'm going to help you kind of work through the guided notes for finance. The first set of notes is simple and compound interest. Again, what we're going to be doing here is just working through the notes the same way that we'd be doing it in class. If you need to take time to practice particular example problems or anything to that effect, make sure that you're pausing the video and giving it a shot before you take a look at the key. The keys are still going to be available on campus. Nothing new there. So make sure that you're using all of the resources that are available to you. So we're going to start by defining interest. Here in the finance chapter, we're going to keep everything very boots on the ground. We're going to be talking about different types of interest today. The first of which is simple, the second of which is compound. I'll be totally frank with you. While we're going to have boots on the ground here, simple interest, you don't see a whole lot. But it's a good place to kind of start. So interest is typically seen as a really negative thing, particularly as we think about our student loans or credit cards or whatever the case may be. Interest has a pretty gnarly connotation to it. Now, on the opposite side of it, if we think about interest as it pertains to a savings account, high interest checking, if we think about the type of interest that we would be gaining through the stock market if we were investing any other time that's not now, pretty much, now interest seems like a really friendly thing, okay? So the way that we want to think about interest is it's a lender's fee. So if you need $20,000 and I have $20,000 to give you, I would be happy to give that to you. I'm providing a service for you. So since I'm providing this service, I'm going to want a little bit of payment for services rendered. So what interest is an opportunity for me, the lender, to be incentivized to loan to you, the recipient. Now, naturally, this sort of equation flips on its head when we talk about who's the lender in a given context, but we'll get to that later, okay? So when we think about simple interest over time, we're going to start with these formulas. Now, I say these formulas, but really they are basically the same thing. So when we talk about what we're talking about, let me get my drawer out here, okay? When we talk about this formula here, that's our interest. That's actually going to be how we compute that sort of fee. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I just realized it's not a good idea for me to use this, but I can use this guy. Yeah, okay. So this is going to be our interest. This is how we compute our interest. A is a different beast altogether. What A is it's how much money is in the account. So we take how much we started with, which we'll define here, and then we add the interest to it, okay? These formulas here, these three little equations, believe it or not, they're all the same thing, okay? They're all exactly the same thing. So don't think of these as three separate bits, but rather three of the same thing. And sometimes it's going to be easier to work with one over the other. Now, I'll tell you, a really common mistake that students will make is they'll use the I formula here when they're supposed to be using the A formula here, and vice versa. Okay, so make sure that you're kind of on top of what's going on there. All right, now, let's define all of these variables. So we define I as interest. A is the amount of the amount in the account at the end of a given time period. So really you could think of that as your principal plus your interest. P0, that's your principal. Okay, that's your initial amount invested or borrowed. R is the interest rate, always in decimal form. So if you see something like 7%, you should be thinking of the R value as 0.07. Okay, and then you've got T for time. A note I want to make about time: the units of measurement should match the time period for the interest rate. So that might change for a given problem. For simple interest, we could be collecting our interest every day. We could be collecting it every month. We could be collecting it every week, year, etc. Be really aware of what the units are. Make sure that you're reading the problem. So let's do this example. So suppose you borrowed $5,000 from a relative. You promised to pay it back in 1 year at 4% simple interest. How much do you end up paying your relative? So make sure that you're filling out these notes as you're doing this, because you're going to reference the formula that we looked at on the previous slide. All right. So if you want to practice this, go ahead and practice on your own. Hit pause and give this one a try. All right. So you borrowed $5,000 from your relative. You promised to pay it back in 1 year at 4% simple interest. Make a note that your T is going to be in years here. Okay, so year is our unit. That's kind of an important deal. We're going to end up using this formula here to see how much we're going to pay our relative. Okay, we're not asking about the, how much interest we've gathered. We want to know how much we're going to pay the relative. Okay, and so we end up with 5,000 as our P0. Let me get a little marker on here. So we've got our P0, our starting value, as $5,000. All right. We knew that we were using this formula in general because we saw simple interest. Okay. Since it's simple interest, we were using this formula. Okay. Just in general. My R value is this guy here. It's 4%. Our T value is going to be equal to 1. Because we said 1 year, okay? So we pretty much mash all these numbers in and we end up with $5,200. That's how much we're gonna pay our relative back at the end of the year. So contextually, I want you to think about what's happening here. So my sister comes to me and says, hey, I need $5,000. I say, yeah, no problem. I have $5,000 on my person. So what I'm gonna go ahead and do is give you $5,000. Now, I'm not doing this out of the goodness of my heart because I could use that $5,000. That $5,000 could be invested. It could be doing all kinds of stuff, right? So in the grand scheme of things, like I'm just saying, hey, I'm doing you a favor, like you should pay me for that action. So what I do is I set my interest at 4% and I say, okay, for 1 year, it's just going to be simple interest. So now what's going to end up happening is my sister's, at the end of the year, she's going to come up to me at the family reunion or barbecue or whatever, and she's going to say, all right, cool, here's $5,200. That's, thank you, even Stevens. And all is well. So that's how we're going to go about making that exchange. Okay, so what really happened was I made $200 in interest, and she got $5,000 from me. Okay. So that's huge. I mean, we both folks benefited. Both folks benefited. All right, now, compound interest. This is a different beast altogether. Compound interest is what you see way more often. You hear folks really freak out about student loan interest or credit card interest or mortgage interest or all of this stuff. They freak out about it because the interest compounds, meaning that the interest sort of reinvests into itself. It sort of feeds back into it. It's not just 6% gathered one time over the year. It's 6% gathered one time over the year, and then 6% gathered on that for the next year, and then 6% on that for the next year, so on and so forth. So if you think of this as like, the interest monster, for simple interest, the interest monster shows up once, takes a look at what's in the account and says, okay, so there's, $5,000 in this account. I'm going to go ahead and collect 1% on that, or I'm sorry, 4% on that. So that's going to be $200. Great. And I'll just do that every year. So what would happen is, think of like in this context, you'd have your account, right? Here's all of the money you've got in there. And so you've got this interest monster, and here he is here. We'll give him antenna because it's a monster. And so here's his eyeball. What the interest monster is going to do here is he's going to look into this account one time. One time he's going to look into this account. And then what he's going to do is he's going to say, okay, cool. So he's going to think to himself, 4% interest at the end of the year. He's going to say, all right, $200. This is really hard to do with a mouse, so give me some credit here. So he's going to look into the account and he's going to say, all right, cool, $200. And that's going to be what's always on his mind. He's never going to think anything outside of that $200. That's just what's going to happen. And every year he's going to take that $200 and just sort of feed that back into the account. Every year, just the $200 is going to go in there. All right. Now, for compounding interest, this is a different beast altogether. I mean, in the context of our interest monster, literally. So what's going to happen is we've got our account here. And here's our interest monster. He's got his little feet. Don't let the interest monster fool you. He's very precious. Sometimes he means way more harm than good. All right, so now, here's the way it's going to work. The sequencing is going to be a little different here. What the interest monster is going to do with compound is the interest monster is going to look into this account and he's going to go, all right. He's going to look into the account and he's going to say, okay, so some percentage of this, let's suppose this was like, I don't know, $200 again. That's fine. So let's suppose it was $200. The interest monster looked into the account and said, all right, cool. $200. Right now, just like the last time, right, what's going to happen is the interest monster is going to take that $200, boom, feed it into the account, and there you go. Now, here's where this interest monster is a little bit different. Now, in this account, what happens is we've got that extra $200 floating in there from when our monster looked into the account, right? Now, here's what's going on with the interest monster this time. Now that that extra $200 is in there, the interest monster sort of has a shorter memory. So now the interest monster is going to look into our account. And actually, let's change this picture a little bit. So now the interest monster already put that $200 in there. Yeah, now this is much better. So now here's the extra $200 that the interest monster threw in there. And now what happens is that becomes a part of the account. So what happens here is my account is now that A value I started with, and then the 200 added onto it. So now here's where the interest monster gets involved in a different way. Whereas before, he only looked in once and decided what it was. Well, now he doesn't see that 200 as like this extra added on thing. He just now sees the account as bigger. And so now let's suppose the interest monster now looks at this and goes, oh, okay, so now this is the actual amount in the account. So now I'm going to go ahead and gather 205. All right, so now the interest monster gathers 205. So now let's go ahead and say, here's the extra 205. It sort of glums on to this account, right? This is now what the interest monster is looking at. So now we go another year. And now what happens is that 205 that was sort of tacked on before, now we don't know that it was tacked on. Now the account's just a little bit bigger. Okay, so now that extra 205, that's now a part of the thing, right? So now the interest monster is going to do what it did before. It's now going to look at that account and it's going to go, oh man, I forgot. How much interest is it? Well, let's see. Okay. So now it's going to do its magical numbers and it's going to say, oh, okay. So now it's going to be $212 that it's going to glum into the account. And so what we're noticing is the mass that the interest monster is looking at and determining what it's going to add to it is getting bigger and bigger. So the interest monster is adding more and more. So that short memory of the interest monster, in this case, really pays back in. Okay, now what we did in the previous one, right? What we did in the previous slide was the interest monster only looked in once and it just kept throwing in there without looking. Now it keeps looking back into the account, okay? So that picture took forever, sorry. Now, when we think about APR, that's our annual percentage rate. Okay, you tend to hear this shouted out during car commercials. Total interest is going to be paid within the year. Okay, so that's what you're looking at there. If interest is paid in smaller time increments, the APR is going to be divided up. So 8% APR paid quarterly would be divided into 4 2% payments. Okay, so you may have to do a little bit of division here to sort of wrap your head around these ideas. All right, so you borrowed $5,000 for a year. Interest is 4% and compounded semi-annually. When you see semi-annually, what that means is twice a year, every 6 months. How much do you end up owing? So after the first 6 months, well, okay, go ahead and use your simple interest formula and compute this. I'll give you a second. You end up having to break this up into 2 problems. So first, you've got your first 6 months, okay? If you notice, we did some unit conversion here. What I want you to observe here is we said, okay, 4% over the year, I'm gathering that twice. That's why I took this and divided it by 2. Basically, that means I gathered 2%, but I only did that once for the first 6 months, okay? All right, and I end up with $5,100. Now I do the same thing again, but this is over the second month. But if you notice, look here, this $5,100 came from this guy. This was what the interest monster did. This was the interest monster now looking in after 6 months and going, okay, so that's what I'm gathering 2% on, right? He didn't just look once, he looked twice. Okay, so the interest monster is going to show up every time, right? And we end up with $5,202. Now, think about this from the perspective of our lender, right? So I lent my sister $5,000, and at the end, if I use simple interest, she paid me $5,200 at the end of the year. Let's suppose I said, okay, here's what we'll do. 4%, but I'll compound it twice in the year. And she goes, okay. Well, at the end of the year, now she's going to pay me $5,202. So I stand to gain $2 more by gathering interest twice instead of once. That's interesting. You wouldn't think that. You wouldn't think that there would be any bit of a difference, right? If you said, okay, well, I'll gather 4% once instead of saying I'll gather 2% twice. Gathering 2% twice does cost a little bit more, which is interesting. You wouldn't think that. That doesn't seem intuitive, right? But that's the good news about math. That's a good thing that math does is whatever we think might be the case, we can actually check it ourselves. And sometimes we find that the way that we naturally think about something isn't quite good enough to really understand what's happening. Okay. Now, compound interest over time, as we start blowing this thing up, so suppose I was gathering it monthly, or suppose I was gathering it, if I were gathering it monthly, I would have to do this same computation 12 times. I would do the same computation 12 times. That'd be a bummer. I mean, who has the time for that? And let's suppose it was 12 times over 5 years, right? Let's suppose I compounded monthly over a 5-year time period. My sister needed, $5,000, and I said, you can pay me back in 5 years. That's fine. I'm in no hurry to get this money back, right? That's going to be 60 times I'm going to have to do this computation, right? There's got to be a quick way to do it. And there is. So here's our formula, okay? This looks a little crazy, but just relax. It's all right. Just take a look at each portion individually. All right. Now, stuff that's familiar. Okay. This guy is definitely familiar. Okay. It's going to be the same thing here. This guy is definitely familiar. It's going to be the same thing here. This guy's definitely familiar. It's going to be the same thing here. This guy doesn't look familiar, but it's not too hard to figure out what's going on here. Okay. Now, what is this thing? What is this N? What is that? Okay. Well, we'll chat about that. So, N is the number of years. There you go. That's the only new thing we're introducing. PN is the amount in the account after N years. P0 is our principal / initial amount. R is the annual interest rate, and that's always going to be in decimal form. In decimal form. Always, always, always in decimal form. If you think to yourself, like, I'm not going to do it in decimal form, then you're doing it wrong, and stop that. Stop doing that. R is in decimal form. K is the number of compounding periods in 1 year. So to expound on K, if we do it annually, that means once. K is equal to 1. Semi-annually is twice. Quarterly is 4. Monthly is 12. Daily is 365. I'll tell you, there are some textbooks that'll say 365.25 to include the leap year. Whatever. That's not a thing that I do. That's not the thing that Lumen does. It's not the thing that Lippmann does. It's not the way that we tend to lead our lives. Now, you're going to see in your book or in your homework the banker's rule. The idea with the banker's rule is that K is equal to 360. We've got 12 months in the year. Bankers say, okay, well, let's just assume there's only 30. And so they say 360. Okay. So we've got a student, and we've got two different banks where you can invest $2,000 that she earned at her part-time job. Both of them offer an annual percentage rate of 3%. However, the first bank's interest is compounded quarterly, and the second bank's interest is compounded monthly. If she doesn't deposit or withdraw any money for 2 years, compare how much money she would have at the end of the 2 years using each bank. So what she's going to do is she's going to take her $2,000 and just drop it into an account. And it's going to do the work. She's not going to put any more. She's not going to take any out. It's just going to sit there. And as it sits there, the interest monster is going to pop in and visit and throw money into her account. Because really, if you think about it, she's now the lender to the bank. She's paying the bank. She's telling the bank, like, hey, do you need money to invest? Cool, I've got some. You can hang on to it. You can invest it. But I'm going to charge you for that action. And she's saying that I will charge you 3%. The thing that makes this different is that the bank actually decides what you get to charge them, which is kind of a weird thing when you think about it. But this is what's happening. We've got these two possible accounts. We've got the one where the interest monster is going to show up quarterly, and the second account is going to be where the interest monster shows up monthly. They both have 3%, right? But what's happening is the interest monster is showing up more often in one account over the other. So really what you have here is two problems. What I need you to do is compute the first bank, which is with quarterly, and then what you're going to need to do is the second bank, which is monthly. So take a second right now and do the first bank for me, where it's compounded quarterly. Go ahead and do that one for me, and then hit pause. Or, I'm sorry, hit pause now, do that for me. All right, so we've got 3% compounded quarterly. We know that K is equal to 4. Since we have 3% compounded quarterly, what we know is that R, since it's 3%, is going to be 0.03. Ooh, this is good. That looks nice. And then I know that we've got 2 years. Okay, so my N is going to be equal to 2. And that's going to be for both accounts, which is kind of nice. So now I'm going to use compounding interest formula because it says here that it's compounded, right? She earned at a part-time job, annual percentage rate, first bank interest is compounded. So when I see the word compounded, I'm using the compounding interest formula, right? And so what we end up with is $2,123.20 after the time of her investment. Okay, round to two places if you're not told, simply by virtue of the fact that we're talking about money. So like round to the nearest penny. In the calculator, this is what you would end up typing. I'll tell you, you would do well to do the 2 times 4 first, and then just type that in as 8. And make sure you're using parentheses liberally. Use them always and forever. I'm telling you, you cannot get in trouble for using too many parentheses. If you use too many parentheses, the calculator is going to think to itself like, okay, that was weird, but whatever. If you don't use enough parentheses, the calculator is going to think you said something that you didn't. Okay, and that's a big deal. So that's going to be for our quarterly compound. Now I want you to go ahead and do that same computation, but with monthly. Okay, I want you to think about what numbers are going to change, which ones aren't. All right, go ahead and take a second and do that for me. All right, so now we're going to take a look at what happens when the interest monster shows up monthly. 3% compounded monthly. Again, R is 0.03. K is now 12 instead of 4 now. So that's an important thing to note. Okay, for K is equal to 12 now, we're talking about the interest monster showing up once a month. So that changes K consistently throughout my formula. Now, N is still 2. We're still talking about 2 years. That's never changed. We also are still starting with $2,000, right? And now what she ends up with is $21.23.51. If you notice, okay, she got 51 cents more by having the interest monster show up once a month. Now, 31 cents is not a big deal. It's just not. It's not. Especially over a 2-year time period. 31 cents over 2 years, that's not a massive deal. And I think that this is an important thing to notice with the finance chapter, is one thing I hear folks talk about a lot in finance is how you're losing money if you do this particular thing over this particular thing, right? A perfect example would be you've got a car note and you've got student loans. Your student loans are around like a 5.8% interest rate. Your car notes around a 7.1% interest rate. You know, if you get you get $20,000 from a lottery or an inheritance or whatever, and you've got that money in your pocket, and let's suppose you can't pay off both of those loans at once, right? There's gonna be some folks that are gonna induce kind of a lot of anxiety, who are gonna say, oh my gosh, you have to pay off like this account first, you have to, or else you're gonna lose all of this money. The reason we have these financial sort of structures, the reason we have these formulas is so that we can check it ourselves. And sometimes we're gonna find that there is a difference, but there's not that much of a difference, right? So if this student were walking into either of these banks, and let's suppose she walked into this bank first, right? She walked into our quarterly bank first. She walked in here first. There are some folks who would stop her on her way into the bank, frantically waving their arms, screaming, no, 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 go to the other bank. You're going to make more money there. Yes, but she's also investing $2,000 over 2 years. This is not a huge amount of money, and this is not a long amount of time. So I personally find this chapter to be really helpful in certain ways, because it frees, like, I feel a little bit more free in making small financial decisions over short periods of time. Now, as we look at larger pools of money over longer periods of time, or pools of money over shorter periods of time, there is a big difference, and that's going to be like a really big deal. And we will talk about those subtleties and that kind of nuance. But you know, sometimes these differences can be small, particularly with a small amount of money over a small amount of time. So on the calculator for the second one, I forgot to click this. Whoops. Again, use parentheses liberally. Me personally, I would never type in 2 times 12. I would happen to know that 2 times 12 is 24. I would type in just the 24 straight up. I would not do the 2 times 12. So follow your hearts on this, but I strongly encourage you to do that computation separately instead of introducing more parentheses than need to be. All right, so that's the first page of the notes. I hope that was really helpful, or that was the first unit of notes. I hope that that's helpful. You do have enough to go into your homework now and actually do the Lumen assignment. You have all the notes from class. I don't know how to use this. Okay.